Real peace after divorce. The house sounded different after she left. Not louder. Not quieter. Just hollow. Daniel stood in the center of the living room, keys still in his hand, listening to the way his own breathing echoed faintly off walls that once held framed photographs and arguments and apologies that never quite fixed anything. The curtains were half drawn. The late afternoon light falling in pale stripes across the hardwood floor. Dust floated lazily through the beams like time itself had slowed down out of pity. The movers had taken the couch that morning. She insisted it was hers. He hadn't argued. There were too many things he hadn't argued about these past few years. The imprint of its legs still marked the wood, 4 dull squares pressed into the grain like a memory refusing to fade. He lowered the keys onto the kitchen counter. The sound rang sharp. Final. It was strange, he thought, how divorce papers looked so small, so harmless. A thin stack of white pages that could dismantle 17 years of shared air and inside jokes and Sunday morning coffee rituals. He had signed them 3 weeks ago. He hadn't cried when he did. Not in the lawyer's office. Not in the car afterward. He had cried in the shower that night, where the water could disguise the trembling. Now the silence pressed in from all sides. He walked slowly through the house, as though touring a museum, dedicated to a life that no longer belonged to him. The hallway still carried the faint scent of her lavender shampoo. The bedroom door creaked when he pushed it open, the mattress bare except for the pale outline where her body used to curve beside his. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty half. It wasn't anger that filled him. That had burned out months ago in sharp, exhausting bursts. What remained was something heavier. A dull ache that sat behind his ribs and pulsed with each breath. Was this peace? People had congratulated him. Quietly, sympathetically. "You'll find yourself again," his brother had said. "It's better this way." His mother insisted, as though repetition could make it truth. Even his colleagues offered careful smiles and told him he looked lighter. Lighter. He felt like a house after a fire. The flames were gone. The smoke had cleared. But everything inside was charred and fragile, ready to collapse with the slightest touch. He sank down on the bedroom floor, back against the wall, and let his head tilt back until it thudded softly against drywall. The ceiling fan above him spun lazily. Its low hum the only evidence that the world continued beyond this room. He closed his eyes. He remembered the night she said it was over. There had been no shouting. That was the strange part. Just a tired calmness in her voice that frightened him more than any raised tone ever could. "I don't feel safe here anymore," she had whispered. He hadn't understood at first. He had never raised a hand to her. Never thrown anything. But safety, he learned too late, wasn't about bruises. It was about feeling heard. About not shrinking yourself to avoid another argument. About not walking on invisible glass every evening. "I'm tired, Daniel," She had said, tears balanced but not falling. I'm so tired of fighting for something that keeps slipping away. He had wanted to argue then. To promise change. To offer therapy and vacations, and late night conversations to stitch together what was tearing apart. But the exhaustion in her eyes mirrored his own. They had both been drowning, clinging to each other so tightly that neither could breathe. The divorce was mutual. That's what the papers said. That's what they told friends. Mutual sounded civilized, mature. It did not describe the nights. He lay awake staring at the dark, feeling the space between them widen like a crack in ice. Daniel opened his eyes. The bedroom felt smaller now. He stood and walked to the closet. Half of it was empty. Hangers swaying slightly from when she'd cleared them out. One of her scarves remained tucked behind a winter coat he rarely wore. He pulled it free, the soft fabric sliding through his fingers. Lavender again. He pressed it to his face before he could stop himself. His chest tightened. I hope you find peace. She had said the day she moved out. He had nodded because he didn't trust his voice. Peace. He had imagined peace as quiet mornings. No tension. No rehearsing conversations in his head before speaking. No waiting for the next misunderstanding to ignite. And yet, standing here now, the quiet felt less like peace and more like absence. He folded the scarf carefully and placed it in a drawer instead of the trash. He told himself it was temporary. He would throw it away soon. He walked back into the living room and lowered himself to the floor where the couch used to be. The wood was cool beneath his palms. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere, a dog barked. Life moving on without ceremony. He leaned back against the wall and exhaled slowly. For years, their marriage had been a series of small fractures. Nothing catastrophic, just constant. Little disappointments. Missed anniversaries. Words spoken too quickly. Apologies delivered too late. They loved each other, he knew that. But love had felt like a fragile object. They kept dropping. Chipping away piece by piece, until it barely resembled what they started with. He wondered when exactly. It shifted from love to survival. When did their conversations become negotiations? When did laughter turn into silence? He brought his knees to his chest and wrapped his arms around them, a posture he hadn't taken since childhood. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a shell. Maybe this was the beginning of real peace. Not the kind people celebrate. Not the triumphant freedom of someone escaping something terrible. But the quiet surrender after a long war, where both sides have lost too much to continue. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the floor. Daniel remained there, as the light faded completely, the room slowly dissolving into darkness. He did not turn on the lights. For the first time in years, there was no one waiting for him to say something. No tension humming beneath the air. No careful monitoring of tone or expression. Just him. And the silence. He swallowed hard and let the stillness settle over him like a blanket he wasn't sure he wanted. Maybe peace didn't feel warm at first. Maybe it felt like this. Cold, empty, terrifying. He closed his eyes again, and in the darkness behind his lids, he whispered her name. Just once, as though testing whether the house would echo it back. It didn't. And that was when he finally understood that this quiet was not punishment. It was the space where he would have to learn how to exist alone. The thought lingered long after the room had surrendered completely to darkness. Daniel didn't move for a while. He let the night wrap around him, thick and unfamiliar. In the past, evenings had followed a predictable rhythm. The clatter of dishes, the murmur of the television neither of them really watched, the soft glow of lamps casting warmth over the furniture. Even during their worst arguments, the house had felt occupied. Now it felt like a paused breath. Eventually, his legs began to ache from sitting on the hard floor. He pushed himself up slowly, joints stiff, and walked toward the kitchen. He didn't turn on the overhead light. Instead, he opened the refrigerator and let its pale interior illumination spill across the tiles. There was almost nothing inside. A carton of eggs, half a bottle of mustard, a container of leftovers he couldn't remember cooking. She used to complain about this, about how he never noticed when they were out of milk or bread. "You live in this house too," she would say, frustration edging her voice. "You should see what needs to be done without me telling you." He had always meant to do better. He closed the refrigerator gently. The clock on the stove read 9:42 p.m. The numbers blinked because he had never reset them after the power flickered 2 days ago. Time felt unreliable now, as though it had lost its structure. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The man looking back at him seemed older than 39. His shoulders curved inward slightly, like he was bracing for impact that had already passed. "Real peace," he murmured to himself. The words felt foreign in his mouth. He carried the water to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress. The sheets were newly washed, the scent of detergent sharp and impersonal. He had changed them the day after she left, as though erasing the familiar imprint might make the transition cleaner. It hadn't. He lay down on his side out of habit, facing the empty half. His hand drifted unconsciously toward the center of the bed, fingers brushing only cool fabric. The silence here was louder. For years, he had complained about her restless sleep. The way she shifted, the occasional soft snore, the way she tugged the blanket. Now he found himself straining to hear those small sounds. Instead, there was only the hum of the ceiling fan. He turned onto his back and stared up at it. His mind replayed moments without permission. The first apartment they shared, too small and cluttered, but full of excitement. The way she laughed when he burned, their first attempt at cooking dinner together. The day they painted this house, arguing about the shade of blue for the living room, until they both ended up streaked with paint and laughing breathlessly on the floor. When had laughter become rare? He swallowed hard. He remembered the last vacation they took. A quiet beach town. They had walked along the shoreline in silence, hands occasionally brushing, but not quite intertwining. He had felt the distance then, like an invisible current, pulling them apart, even as they stood side by side. "I miss us," she had said that night, her voice barely audible over the waves outside their hotel window. "I'm right here," he had replied, defensive without meaning to be. She had looked at him for a long time before turning away. Now, lying alone, he understood what she meant. He wasn't there. Not fully. He had been distracted by work, by his own frustrations, by the constant internal pressure to be stronger, better, less vulnerable. He had mistaken silence for stability, mistaken avoidance for peace. The irony twisted painfully in his chest. A tear slid sideways into his ear. He wiped it away impatiently. He didn't want to romanticize what they had lost. The truth was heavy and unkind. They had both hurt each other in subtle, relentless ways. He had withdrawn when she needed closeness. She had criticized when he needed patience. Over time, they had built walls in self-defense. Bricks laid carefully with every unresolved argument, until the walls were too thick to see through. He sat up abruptly, unable to lie still any longer. The bed felt too wide, too accusing. He walked back into the living room and turned on a single lamp. The soft yellow light carved out a small island in the darkness. He lowered himself into the corner where the couch once stood and leaned his head back against the wall. Outside, rain began to fall. Soft at first, then steady. The sound against the windows was strangely comforting. He closed his eyes and let the rhythm wash over him. Maybe peace wasn't the absence of pain. Maybe it was the absence of chaos. There were no raised voices tonight. No tense silences stretched across dinner. No carefully worded sentences designed to avoid misunderstanding. No bracing for disappointment. Just rain. And the steady beat of his own heart. He realized then that, for the first time in years, he didn't feel on edge. Sad? Yes. Hollow undeniably. But not defensive. Not coiled tight with anticipation of the next argument. The difference was subtle but undeniable. He inhaled deeply, letting the air fill his lungs without restriction. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the quiet, unsure whether he was speaking to her or to himself. The apology hung in the air, unanswered. He imagined her in her new apartment across town, unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, perhaps feeling this same strange mixture of relief and grief, perhaps sleeping more soundly tonight than she had in years. The thought hurt, but it also brought a sliver of comfort. If she was finding peace, then maybe the ending had not been entirely tragic. He rested his forehead against his knees and let the rain continue its steady confession against the glass. There was a freedom in this loneliness, though it frightened him to admit it. No one expected anything from him right now. He could sit on the floor until morning, if he wanted. He could leave dishes in the sink. He could cry without explaining why. The space around him felt vast, terrifying, possibly healing. The rain grew heavier, drumming insistently as if urging him forward, though he didn't know toward what. He stayed there until the lamp flickered slightly, until the clock blinked past midnight, until exhaustion finally wrapped its arms around him. When he eventually returned to the bedroom, he did not hesitate before turning off the light. He lay down on his back this time, staring into darkness without reaching toward the empty space beside him. And, as sleep began to claim him, he realized something fragile but real. The silence no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like an unfamiliar companion, sitting quietly at the edge of the bed, waiting for him to learn its name. Daniel woke before the alarm that no longer needed to be set. For a moment, he didn't remember. The early morning light filtered softly through the curtains, pale and almost gentle. He lay still, suspended in that fragile space between sleep and awareness. Then he turned his head slightly and saw the untouched pillow beside him. Memory settled like weight on his chest. He exhaled slowly and pushed himself upright. The house greeted him with the same steady quiet as the night before. No running shower. No cabinet doors opening and closing. No voice asking if he wanted coffee. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there longer than necessary, listening. Nothing. He walked to the bathroom and caught sight of himself in the mirror. His eyes were rimmed red, but calmer than he expected. There was no swelling panic. No tightness clawing at his throat. Just a dull ache. He turned on the faucet and let the cold water run over his hands. The shock grounded him. He stared at his reflection as droplets slid down his wrists. "This is real," he said softly. The words did not break him. He dressed without much thought, choosing a shirt from the left side of the closet, the side that was still his. The right side hung open and vacant, like a missing tooth. He shut the closet door firmly. In the kitchen, he made coffee for one. The ritual felt awkward. He almost measured out enough grounds for 2 cups before catching himself. He leaned against the counter as the machine hummed, watching the dark liquid drip slowly into the pot. 17 years of shared mornings, reduced to 1 mug. He carried it to the small kitchen table and sat in the chair he usually occupied. Her chair faced him, empty. He looked at it for a long moment before deliberately turning his body slightly away. He took a sip. It tasted stronger than usual. Maybe he had always relied on her to soften things. The thought lingered. Work felt distant and unimportant, yet it waited for him all the same. He debated calling in sick, but the idea of staying in this house all day unsettled him. The walls felt closer in daylight. He grabbed his keys and stepped outside. The air was cool and washed clean from the night's rain. The sky stretched pale blue overhead, deceptively peaceful. Birds moved between branches as though nothing significant had shifted in the world. His car sat in the driveway, exactly where he'd left it. As he drove through familiar streets, he noticed small things he had never paid attention to before. The cracked sidewalk near the corner, the faded paint on the neighborhood sign, the way sunlight hit the bakery window on Main Street. Everything looked the same, and yet everything felt altered. At a red light, he caught himself reaching for his phone to text her. A habit formed from years of small updates. Running late. Don't forget milk. Love you. His hand froze midair. There was no one waiting for those messages now. He let his arm drop back to his side and stared straight ahead until the light turned green. At work, colleagues offered cautious nods. A few approached with quiet sympathy. "How are you holding up?" His manager asked, voice low. "I'm okay." Daniel replied automatically. It wasn't entirely a lie. He moved through the day mechanically, answering emails, attending meetings, nodding in the right places. The rhythm was familiar enough to carry him. No one mentioned her name. No one needed to. Around lunchtime, he found himself alone in the break room. He opened the fridge and placed his simple sandwich on the counter. The room smelled faintly of reheated leftovers and burnt popcorn. He sat down and stared at the wall. He expected a sudden wave of grief to knock him, breathless. Instead, what came was something quieter, a sense of stillness. As though the storm had already passed, and he was standing in its aftermath, surveying the damage. He realized how exhausted he had been. Not just from arguments, but from constant vigilance. From trying to anticipate her moods. From bracing for disappointment. From defending himself, even when she wasn't attacking. He had loved her fiercely. But somewhere along the way, love had turned into effort. Relentless, draining effort. He pressed his fingers against his temples. Was it possible that this quiet, this painful, lonely quiet, was the first honest thing they had given each other in years? The thought startled him. After work, he didn't drive straight home. Instead, he turned toward the park near the river. He hadn't been there in months. They used to walk there on weekends, hands brushing, arguing gently about trivial things like which path to take. He parked and stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The river moved steadily, indifferent and constant. Sunlight flickered across its surface. A few joggers passed him, headphones in, focused and separate. He walked slowly along the familiar path. Memories rose uninvited. The time she tripped over a loose stone and laughed so hard she couldn't stand up. The way she would lean against him on the bench, near the water, her head resting briefly on his shoulder before pulling away, as if afraid of wanting too much. He reached that bench now and sat down. The wood was cool beneath him. He let the silence stretch out. "I hope you're okay," he whispered, staring at the water. The river did not answer. He thought about calling her. Not to rekindle anything. Just to hear her voice. to confirm she still existed in the same world as him. But he knew that would only reopen wounds that were trying, slowly, to close. So he stayed seated, hands clasped loosely between his knees. A child's laughter echoed somewhere behind him. A dog barked joyfully, life continuing without pause. He felt the ache in his chest again. But it no longer felt sharp. It felt honest. They had both tried. They had both failed. And now, for the first time in a long time, there was no one to blame. The realization settled into him like a quiet truth. He wasn't angry at her. He wasn't even angry at himself. He was grieving something that had ended long before the papers were signed. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the path. Daniel stood slowly, taking one last look at the river's steady movement. Maybe peace wasn't something you felt all at once. Maybe it arrived in fragments. Small, fragile moments where your chest didn't tighten, and your thoughts didn't race, and your heart simply existed. He turned and walked back to his car. When he arrived home, the house still felt empty. But it no longer felt hostile. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and stood in the quiet entryway. For the first time since she left, he did not brace himself for the silence. He let it greet him. And in that stillness, something inside him shifted. Small, almost imperceptible. The absence was still there. But beneath it, like a faint pulse, was the beginning of something softer. Something that did not demand or accuse. Something that might, one day, resemble real peace. The days began to arrange themselves into a quieter rhythm. Daniel stopped expecting the silence to break. It didn't. A week passed, then another. He found himself waking at the same early hour, making coffee for one without hesitation now. The second mug remained in the cabinet, untouched. He had considered moving it, boxing it away, but something about its presence felt honest. It wasn't a shrine. It was simply evidence. Evidence that something had existed. One evening, while rinsing his plate in the sink, he noticed he was humming. The sound startled him so much he stopped mid-note. He stood there, hands dripping with water, listening to the echo fade. He couldn't remember the last time he had hummed absent-mindedly. The realization wasn't joyful. It was fragile, like stepping onto ice that might hold or might crack. He dried his hands and walked into the living room. The space where the couch once stood no longer felt like a wound. He had bought a simple chair 2 days ago. Not as comfortable, not as familiar, but his. He lowered himself into it and looked around. The walls were bare where photographs used to hang. He had taken them down carefully, wrapping each frame in newspaper, before placing them in a box in the hallway closet. He hadn't opened that box again. Not out of avoidance. Out of respect, he leaned back in the chair and let his eyes close. There were still moments when grief arrived without warning. At the grocery store, when he passed her favorite cereal. At a stoplight when a song they both loved played unexpectedly on the radio. In those seconds, his chest would tighten, and he would have to grip the steering wheel until the feeling passed. But it always passed. That was new. One Saturday afternoon, he found himself cleaning the garage. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't urgent. But he needed to move, to sort through something tangible. Boxes labeled in her handwriting lined one wall. Holiday decorations, old textbooks, kitchen appliances they never used. He opened one at random. Inside were photo albums. He hesitated only briefly before sitting down on the concrete floor and pulling one into his lap. The first picture was from their wedding day. She was laughing at something he had whispered. Her head tilted slightly back, eyes bright with certainty. He stared at the image for a long time. They had meant it. Every vow, every promise. They had believed in the future they were stepping into. He turned the page. Vacations. Birthdays. Ordinary Tuesdays captured in soft, smiling snapshots. The progression was subtle but visible. Their smiles grew thinner over the years. Their bodies angled slightly away from each other. He traced the edge of one photograph gently. "I'm sorry we couldn't keep it," he murmured. His voice did not break. For the first time, he allowed himself to see the marriage as something complete. Not ruined. Not wasted. Just finished. A chapter that had shape and meaning, even if it did not last forever. He closed the album and placed it back in the box. The garage felt less cluttered after that, though nothing had physically changed. Later that evening, his phone buzzed. Her name appeared on the screen. His heart stumbled once, hard enough to make him sit down. He stared at it, thumb hovering uncertainly. It rang until it almost stopped before he answered. "Hello." There was a small pause, filled with shared history. She said softly. Her voice sounded the same, and different. He replied. Another pause. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay," she said. "I know it's been a few weeks." He leaned back against the kitchen counter, steadying himself. "I'm okay," he answered, and this time the words felt more true. "I'm glad," she said. He could hear faint background noise. Traffic, maybe. "I was worried." He almost laughed at the irony. They were better at caring for each other from a distance. "How are you?" he asked. There was a slight hesitation. "Quieter," she admitted. "Lonely sometimes, but calmer." He nodded even though she couldn't see it. "Yeah," he said. "Calmer." Silence settled between them, but it was not heavy. It wasn't filled with accusation or unfinished arguments. It was simply space. "I don't regret it," she said gently. "Do you?" He closed his eyes. The honest answer rose without resistance. "No," he said. The word carried sadness, but not bitterness. "Me neither," she whispered. They stayed on the phone a few minutes longer, speaking about practical things. The mail. A shared subscription that needed canceling. Ordinary details. When the conversation naturally thinned, neither of them rushed to prolong it. "Take care of yourself." Daniel, she said. You too. He ended the call and stared at the darkened screen. His chest ached, but differently now. It wasn't the sharp panic of loss. It was the steady recognition of change. He realized he no longer wanted to convince her to come back. He didn't want to rewind to the version of them that was slowly unraveling. He wanted her to find what she couldn't find with him. And he wanted the same for himself. He stepped outside onto the small back porch. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. The sky was streaked with fading orange and violet. He leaned against the railing and let the quiet surround him. For years, he had equated peace with togetherness, with solving problems, with holding on tightly enough that nothing could slip away. Now, he understood something else. Sometimes peace required letting go before resentment hardened beyond repair. Sometimes love meant accepting that two people could be good and kind and still wrong for each other in the long run. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs without effort. The ache was still there. It might always be. But it no longer controlled him. He stood there until the last of the light drained from the sky, until the first stars appeared, faint and distant. Inside the house, the quiet waited for him. Not as an enemy, not as a void, but as a steady presence that no longer frightened him. He stepped back through the door, closing it gently behind him. And as he moved through the dimly lit rooms, he realized that the silence had begun to feel less like emptiness and more like space. Winter arrived quietly. Daniel noticed it one morning when frost traced delicate veins across the edges of his bedroom window. He stood there for a while, fingertips grazing the cold glass, watching his breath bloom and fade against it. The house no longer startled him with its silence. It greeted him like something familiar now, like an old coat he had resisted wearing, but eventually found comfort in. He had rearranged the living room last week. The chair was angled toward the window, instead of the blank wall. A small bookshelf stood where the couch once had, filled with novels he had meant to read for years, but never opened. A soft rug covered the faint marks in the wood floor. The space felt lived in again. Not shared, but lived in. On Sundays, he began walking to the bakery on Main Street instead of driving. The owner, a woman with flour, dusted hands and tired eyes, started recognizing him. She would nod and ask, "The usual," and he would smile faintly. The usual. A word that once belonged to marriage. Now it belonged to him. He carried his coffee and pastry to the park by the river. The same bench where he had once sat and whispered hope into moving water. The river flowed steadily, indifferent to seasons, indifferent to endings. He found comfort in its consistency. There were still nights when memories surfaced with sharp clarity. The curve of her smile, the exact way she used to say his name when she was half asleep. On those nights, he did not fight the ache. He let it sit beside him, acknowledged it like an old friend. Grief, he had learned, did not demand eradication. It demanded recognition. One evening, months after the divorce was finalized, his phone buzzed again. Her name. He didn't hesitate this time. "Hi," he answered, voice steady. "Hi," she replied. She sounded lighter. They spoke about ordinary things again. Work. Weather. A mutual friend's engagement. The conversation felt natural, almost easy. "I met someone," she said gently. There it was. The sentence he had known would come eventually. His chest tightened for a brief, honest second. Then he inhaled slowly. "Oh," he said. "He's kind," she continued. "It's still new. I didn't want you to hear it from someone else." He closed his eyes and let the truth move through him. There was no rage, no jealousy sharp enough to wound. Just a quiet sadness and something unexpectedly close to relief. "I'm glad," he said, and meant it. She exhaled, as if bracing for a different reaction. "You are." "Wes." He looked around his living room. The bookshelf, the rug, the angled chair. His life, reshaped. "I hope he makes you feel safe," he added softly. There was a pause. Then he heard her breath hitch. "Thank you," she whispered. They didn't talk much longer. When the call ended, Daniel remained seated, phone resting loosely in his hand. The house was quiet, but it did not echo. He stood and walked to the window. Snow had begun to fall, slow and deliberate, covering the yard in white. Each flake landed without sound, layering the ground in something clean. He realized then that peace was not the absence of love. It was the absence of fear. He no longer feared coming home. He no longer feared saying the wrong thing. He no longer feared silence, stretching between words. He missed her sometimes with an ache that surprised him. But he did not miss the tension. He did not miss the feeling of shrinking himself to preserve something already breaking. Weeks later, he found himself at the river again, snow crunching softly beneath his boots. The bench was cold, but he sat anyway. He thought about the man he had been a year ago. Tired, defensive, constantly braced. He had believed holding on was strength. Now he understood that letting go had required far more courage. A couple walked past him, hands intertwined, laughing at something private and warm. He watched them without bitterness. Love, he realized, was not a singular chance. It was not a fixed destination you either reached or failed. It was a season. Some seasons lasted decades. Others ended before you were ready. But each one left you altered. He leaned back and closed his eyes, listening to the river's steady current beneath the thin crust of forming ice. "I hope you're happy," he murmured, not with longing but with sincerity. The words felt clean. He sat there until the cold crept through his coat and into his bones. When he finally stood, he felt grounded in a way he hadn't in years. Back at home, he lit a small lamp and opened one of the novels from his shelf. The pages smelled faintly of paper and dust. He read slowly, not to distract himself, but to accompany the quiet. The chair fit his body now, The house held his footsteps without echoing someone else's absence. Before bed, he paused in the hallway closet and pulled out the box of photographs. He carried it to the living room and set it gently on the rug. He did not open it. He didn't need to. The memories were no longer sharp edges. They were part of him, woven into the person he was becoming. He placed the box back in the closet, not hidden, just stored. Then he turned off the lights and walked to his bedroom. The pillow beside him remained untouched. But the sight of it did not hollow him out. He lay down, hands resting loosely on his chest, and stared into the dark. The silence was complete. No tension. No waiting. No unfinished arguments pressing against his ribs. Just breath moving in and out. Just a heart beating steadily, without bracing for impact. As sleep drifted closer, he understood something with quiet certainty. The marriage had not been a failure. It had been a chapter. And this stillness, this unforced calm, this gentle ability to sit alone without unraveling, this was real peace after divorce.